In this video, I want to talk a little bit about what it means to be gifted in terms of eligibility, how that looks in a school. And this is going to vary from school to school, especially in Minnesota, since Minnesota doesn't mandate services. But it will look different, not just in Minnesota, but around the country. Now, the traditional approach is based solely on IQ scores. This is not an appropriate approach anymore, and it's never really been an appropriate approach, but it's the traditional approach. Traditionally, IQ score was used, and there was a cut score of either 130 in some school districts or some states, or a score of 125 in some. In some places, it was as low as 120. We know that overall, the population, about 2.2% of all people have an IQ score of over 130. And so again, taking this very simplistic idea of IQ, let's look at our typical 10-year-old again. So an IQ of 130 means that 10-year-old's mental age is 13. So again, that would be someone at the start of 5th grade who's working at an 8th grade level. We know that only just over 2% of people around the country, or really around the world, would have an IQ score at this level or above. And so what this means is that if you were in an elementary school or middle school that had 100 5th graders, we would expect 2 or 3 of the 5th graders in the entire building to have an IQ score over 130. Maybe you're in a middle school setting, and so maybe it's a large middle school, and so maybe you have 400 5th graders. And so then we would expect around 9 students out of 400 to be at this level. So in other words, this is very rare. Most students traditionally were not considered gifted. And this is considered a more exclusive type of gifted services, and you still find proponents of this, but they're very much in the minority view, I think. Now, because of the way IQ works, we know that it is much more common at the next grouping between 120 and 129. We know that 6.7% of all people's IQ is in this range, and a greater percentage is at the 120 level than at the 129 level. But if we add these together, about 9% of individuals with IQs of 120 or above, which would be a much larger part of a typical school. So I share this with you just to point out that when we're talking about children who are gifted, we are talking about a pretty small subset of the overall school population. Traditionally, using this traditional approach. Now, we know today, and we've known for decades, that IQ should be only one factor of many examined. But it should be an important factor. In other words, if you have a kid whose IQ is 140, regardless of anything else, that kid is gifted. They need gifted services, and I will die on that hill. On the other hand, if you have an IQ of 118, that child may or may not be gifted, and you want to look at other factors. If you have an IQ of 122, 123, 127, again, you want to look at other factors. But if you have a super high, super rare IQ, that child needs gifted services, period. If the IQ is less, they may or may not. Now, IQ scores, I should point out, we talk about them overall. There are IQ tests that really drill down, and so you get it's sort of the equivalent score, this ability type score for a particular subject area. Remember, it's possible to be gifted just in math or just in science or just in reading or just in one or two of those things. There's also ways to evaluate creativity. There are different scales for that. There are also ways to evaluate leadership as well, and so those might be used as well. I want to show you the bell curve. The bell curve is super controversial because a few years ago, more like 20 years, more than 20, probably like 30 years ago now, there are a couple of authors who misused this idea of the bell curve or the normal curve to argue some very racist thoughts. No one agrees with those. No one should agree with those thoughts. Let me say that. And honestly, almost no one in education does, almost no one in giftedness does. It was roundly condemned, and it was clearly the most generous is that it was a misinterpretation of things. It was a misunderstanding, but it definitely had racist overtones. So keeping that in mind, this is the bell curve is true for a whole variety of things, not just intelligence. It is, when we look at an entire population, it describes height, it describes weight, it describes lots of things for lots of different populations, whether they be humans, animals, plants, other things. Many things in nature fall along this bell curve or bell-shaped curve, including, most likely, intelligence. And so this is true not just for white people, or not just for black people, or not just for American Indians. It is true for everyone. And so when we see IQ here, what we see is that about 2/3 of a population, so think of this as 2/3 of all students, have an IQ that ranges from 85 to 115. And again, looking at our sort of classic simplified example, I like using a 10-year-old because it's a nice fraction to work with. We have a 10-year-old whose mental age is 8.5. So in other words, that child is working mentally, intellectually, at about halfway through 3rd grade. That would be an IQ right here. And we have another student in the same class. Their IQ is 115. That means their mental age is about halfway through 6th grade. This typical range, 85 to 115, 2/3 of all people, this is just an average typical range. These are kids who you would have in your class. You will not know their IQs, and they will all roughly be at about the same level. Some of your kids might struggle a little bit, and some of your kids might excel a little bit, but most of your kids are right about average. These are children who would normally not receive any sort of special services, because your high quality teaching is going to meet their needs just fine. Then we have the next standard deviation. So IQs they are sometimes considered a standard. Some tests do a standard deviation of 15, like this one is, and some do a standard deviation of 10. So we'll sometimes say 90 to 110 instead of 85 to 115 for some IQ things. That is a smaller percentage range. The next group of ages on either side, these are kids who we might consider above average or below average. And so traditionally. And so these are those students who are working from middle of 6th grade to about the start of 8th grade in your 5th grade classroom. So from 1.5 years above where they are to 3 years above. And over here, these are your students who are working from 2nd grade to about halfway through 3rd grade. These are sort of borderline students today. The above average group includes students who would normally not receive gifted services. And that's probably this sort of part of the curve. Like this is probably about 125 IQ right here. This part right here, that I don't know how well you can see these X's, but these are kids who, if we're only looking at IQ, would probably traditionally not qualify for gifted services and probably wouldn't need gifted services. They are above average, and so you need to challenge them a little bit, but it's something that's not a big deal for a teacher to do. Now, in the lower end, these are students who historically were really underserved. The kids in this range from 70 to 85 are the kids that were working below average, but they didn't qualify for any special ed services for various reasons because of the way learning disabilities used to be defined. And so these were students who did struggle throughout school, but they were doing too well for special ed. This is one reason why today in our MTSS or RTI approach, these students' needs are met, are hopefully met, are met in a better way than they were a generation or two ago. Now, this next range, 55 to 70, these are students who are classified, if we're looking just at IQ, as having an intellectual disability, a mild one. And this mild intellectual disability is about 2% of all people. Oftentimes, especially if it's at the higher end of this, you would not necessarily know this. And these are students who after school will go and usually have very productive lives. They raise a family, they will have a job, they will be productive citizens. This very tiny percentage of students whose IQ is below 55 are students with a moderate, severe, or profound intellectual disability. We're looking just at IQ. And these are students who will typically need more societal support to succeed in life outside of school. Very rare. On the other end of the curve, we have this range, 130 to 145. I mentioned this before. I said 2, so altogether this is 2.2%. These are rounded figures, by the way. Rare. And then above 145, super rare. Again, 0.1%. So in a school of 1,000 students, you would expect to see one student with an IQ above 145. And in reality, it may not work out that way. You may have 2 or 3, you may have 0, but that's what we would expect. So whenever we're getting above 130, we are definitely talking about children who need gifted services. That is a definite. When we're in this range, 115 to 130, we want to look at things beyond IQ. Disproportion representation. This is an issue in many areas, including in gifted. And what we know is that Asian and white students are more likely than average to be classified as gifted, and Hispanic and Black students are less likely. American Indian and Alaska Native students are actually right about where we would expect them probably to be. And I say that because we don't have a settled definition of what percentage of students should be considered gifted. But we would expect all of these numbers should be identical, and they aren't. We would probably expect in a school from 5 to 10% of kids to be gifted. Probably on the lower end, since some schools, like in Minnesota, don't identify or provide gifted services. But still, it is true that kids who are Asian are far more likely than average to be identified gifted, and kids who are white are above average identified, and kids who are Hispanic and Black are below average. Those are concerns, and they relate to a wide variety of things. It's not the fault of gifted education, and it's not the fault of gifted learners. Its possibilities include systemic racism in schools, the fact that teachers aren't trained in identification, and the fact that in traditional intelligence tests, oftentimes both Black students and students for whom English is not their first language, including many, but certainly not all, Hispanic students, underperform for various reasons. That is less true on more modern tests, but it still is potentially an issue. We know, for example, that there have been studies that the best way to improve Black representation among gifted programs, especially for young Black male students, is to identify them very early in the school process. Identifying them as kindergartners or first graders tends to result in higher numbers than waiting until middle school or high school. So there's no single set of characteristics for kids who are gifted. I think we know that by now. And giftedness can coexist with any other exceptionality. We also know that some exceptionalities are probably mislabeled giftedness. One example is ADHD. If kids are bored, they are not going to pay attention, and they are going to at times be hyperactive. They might also act out in ways that get them an emotional behavior disturbed label. Similarly, high functioning autism probably includes kids who are misidentified gifted. Gifted traits include some traits that are associated with that, including things like being highly sensitive to touch, taste, and sound, including intense areas of interest and focus, and at times issues with socialization. However, that doesn't mean they have autism at times. If their IQ is 150, they're going to probably have issues socializing with other 10-year-olds because in some respects they are acting, their brain is like that of a 15-year-old in some areas. So no matter where you teach, if your school has gifted services, which they should, and which I would hope you will advocate for. It's one of my hopes for you in this class. How will they be identified? How will kids get the services they need? How will you know who needs the services? We know that identification for gifted should be what's called multimodal. In other words, it should use a variety of things. Intelligence tests are important, and they should be one component, but they should not be the only component. Testing is important, but it's not the only thing. We should look at things like student work samples. If you do projects in your class and you have a kid whose projects are consistently above and beyond their peers, if you have a kid who you have class discussion and their insight is above and beyond her peers, if you are doing anything in your class and you have this child who consistently does way better than his peers or her peers or their peers, that is a sign, those work samples that you as a teacher have, that is one sign of potential giftedness. It also depends on how much effort. It also may depend on how much effort the child puts into it. And you have to be cautious of this. You need to sort of ask parents and say, this is a great project. How much did they work on it at home? Now, if the kid is just really into the project, they're probably going to put a lot of effort into it. And that's a good thing. But again, think of grades. If they're putting forth, 100% of the time, to get A's in your class, that's just a hard worker. That's not necessarily someone who's gifted. The identification should match the programming. In other words, if you're in elementary school and your only gifted programming is enrichment, your identification should involve the sorts of activities they're going to do in the programming. If you're in a middle school and your only gifted services that are being offered are in English class, then the identification should focus on the skills that they would need in English class. Or if your only gifted services offered are in a STEM club, then identification should focus on those skills. Identification should be flexible. It should not be inflexible. In other words, the purpose of gifted services is to give those services to kids who need them, and that involves sometimes being flexible, and that a child who may not meet one particular criterion but would still really benefit from the services, we should look for another way to identify that child. They should be reasonable. If your school says no more than 2% of our students are going to be gifted, or we won't let more than a certain number at a grade level be gifted, that's problematic. That's not reasonable. And it should show true concern for children. It is definitely true that some parents do see gifted services as a status symbol, and that's unfortunate. It's important that the identification process is child-centered. So what are things we might look at? I've mentioned some of these already, so I won't spend a lot of time on them. Again, intelligence is an important component, but it's not the only one. There are different types of intelligence tests. Different schools do different ones. The most accurate and the least biased are individual tests. Some schools do group tests instead. And these are good as screeners, if nothing else. And again, if a child does really well on a test, especially if that kid doesn't do well in class, that is a huge sign that they're potentially gifted. Similarly, achievement tests could include state testing. One thing a school should do is look at state test scores and then notice, are there kids who are scoring exemplary whose grades in class are maybe not exemplary? Or are there kids scoring exemplary who are it surprises us for some reason? Those are kids who very, very much might be gifted. And obviously kids who score exemplary might just on their own might also be gifted. Nominations are okay. Again, teacher nominations can be problematic just because teachers tend not to know what to look for because we haven't been trained in it. Sometimes parents can nominate, sometimes students or peers can nominate, and those can work well at times. And I think we mentioned before, product evaluation. So a little bit in this one about evaluation of gifted. In our next slide, in our next set, we'll take a look at the different domains of giftedness, and we'll start looking more about how we can meet gifted students' needs in our classes. Thanks for listening.